Imagine standing in a grand hall where marble floors echo with whispers of power, betrayal, and ambition. The air is heavy with the scent of incense and intrigue, and all around you are portraits of queens whose eyes seem to follow you, silently pleading to be remembered as more than the villain's history has painted them to be. For centuries, these women have been reduced to caricatures. The madwoman locked away, the schemer blamed for rivers of blood, the frivolous aristocrat accused of mocking the hungry, the reckless queen condemned for ambition. Their names became shorthand for failure, excess, or cruelty, and their humanity was buried beneath layers of myth and propaganda. But what if those stories were wrong, or at least incomplete? What if Joanna of Castile was not insane, but a grieving wife betrayed by her own family? What if Mary, Queen of Scots, was not reckless, but trapped in a web of politics she could never escape? What if Catherine de Medici was not simply a poisoner and plotter, but a woman fighting to keep her kingdom from tearing itself apart? And what if Marie Antoinette was not the heartless aristocrat who said, "Let them eat cake," but a mother who faced death with courage and dignity? History has always had a way of simplifying women who held power, shaping them into villains when their lives proved too complicated to fit into neat categories. Tonight, we pull back the veil of villainy and look again at the queens we thought we knew, uncovering truths long hidden beneath centuries of slander. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we will explore the misunderstood lives of these queens, challenge the myths that surround them, and ask what their stories still mean for us today. The story of history is often told in the language of heroes and villains. Some figures are remembered as saints or saviors, while others are trapped behind a veil of infamy. Yet the truth, as time and scholarship continue to show, is rarely as simple as these labels suggest. One striking example comes from the life of Queen Joanna of Castile, more often remembered by the unflattering name given to her after her death, the Mad Queen. For centuries, her image was bound up in tales of hysteria, instability, and political weakness. To many, she has been a symbol of fragility at the heart of one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. Yet beneath the convenient narrative of madness lies a more complicated and revealing truth about power, gender, and the way history is written. What we call villainy or weakness in the pages of old chronicles was often nothing more than resistance to control or refusal to conform. Joanna's story is a reminder that our first impressions of those labeled villains by history deserve to be questioned, not simply accepted. To appreciate how deeply this veil of villainy shaped Joanna's memory, one must return to the time in which she lived. She was born in the late 15th century to Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs whose union had created the foundation of a united Spain. Their reign was marked by military triumph, religious zeal, and ruthless political ambition. They were not figures who left much space for softness or deviation from the iron demands of statecraft. Into this world came Joanna, their daughter, whose life was not her own from the moment she was born. Her marriage to Philip the Handsome, Archduke of Austria and heir to the Habsburg line, was arranged to secure alliances that would strengthen Spain's position in Europe. Her personal feelings mattered little in this grand design. In this sense, she was not unlike countless princesses of her age, traded across borders to cement treaties and dynastic dreams. Yet the narrative that later unfolded around her was not the same as that of her sisters or contemporaries. She became the one remembered for madness, the one reduced to caricature. The stories told about Joanna fixate on her supposed instability. Chroniclers and later historians described her as jealous, prone to fits of rage, and unable to rule with clarity of mind. The most enduring tale is the image of her obsessively clinging to the corpse of her husband Philip after his sudden death, allegedly wandering across Castile with his coffin and refusing to let him be buried. This grotesque image, repeated again and again, became the emblem of her madness. It was a story that fit neatly into the expectations of the age, a woman overcome by passion, incapable of reason, unfit for power. When she was confined to Tordesillas for the remaining decades of her life, the narrative seemed complete. A tragic queen had been overcome by her own demons, while her father and later her son, the great Emperor Charles, assumed control of her kingdom. But how much of this tale is history, and how much of it is invention, crafted to serve the ambitions of those around her? To challenge the villainous or pitiable impression of Joanna, one must look closely at who stood to gain from her erasure. Her father, Ferdinand, had every reason to depict her as incapable. After Philip's death, Ferdinand sought to reclaim control of Castile, which technically belonged to Joanna by right. If she were seen as a competent sovereign, Ferdinand's authority would have been questioned. It was far more convenient to describe her as mentally unstable, unable to govern, in need of guidance and restraint. Later, her son Charles also found advantage in maintaining this fiction. As he built his vast empire, stretching from Spain to the Americas and across Europe, it was far easier to rule in his own name if his mother remained hidden, locked away, her authority dismissed. To admit her competence would have meant recognizing her sovereignty, complicating the smooth transfer of power he desired. In both cases, the label of madness was a political tool. It is important to note that contemporaries who met Joanna in person often left accounts that complicate the official story. Ambassadors described her as intelligent, devout, and aware of her rights. Some even noted that her supposed episodes of jealousy or anger were far from irrational. They were responses to real betrayals and humiliations. Philip was notoriously unfaithful, flaunting his affairs and undermining her status as queen. To react with distress or anger was human, not evidence of illness. Moreover, when she resisted the signing of certain documents or agreements, it was often because she understood their implications for her authority. Her refusal to comply was painted as obstinacy born of madness, when in truth it may have been the resistance of a ruler who understood she was being sidelined. What is labeled as hysteria in a woman might have been called firmness or strength in a man. The coffin story, so central to her legend, also appears more questionable when examined closely. While there is some evidence she accompanied Philip's body for a time, the lurid details of her opening the coffin to gaze upon him or traveling aimlessly with it seem to have been exaggerated, if not wholly fabricated. The image of the deranged widow was too convenient for those who wished to underline her instability. It also fit a broader cultural script, one that saw women as especially vulnerable to excess emotion, incapable of reason when touched by grief or passion. By emphasizing this story, chroniclers ensured that Joanna's reputation would be fixed in the imagination as a cautionary tale. Yet it says more about the prejudices of her age than it does about the woman herself. What makes Joanna's story especially revealing is the way it illustrates a wider pattern in history. Figures who resist control, especially women, are often cast in the role of villain or lunatic. Their reputations become warnings, their humanity stripped away to serve political ends. The veil of villainy is not unique to Joanna, but her case shows how durable and damaging it can be. For centuries, the term Mad Queen overshadowed any recognition of her intelligence, her rightful sovereignty, or the injustice of her confinement. Schoolbooks, novels, and even operas kept the image alive. Generations of readers and audiences accepted the caricature without questioning its origins. It is only in more recent scholarship that her story has begun to be reconsidered, her voice recovered from beneath layers of distortion. One cannot ignore, either, the role of gender in shaping how Joanna was remembered. Male rulers who displayed suspicion, ruthlessness, or anger were often celebrated as strong leaders. When women acted similarly, they were branded as unstable or wicked. In Joanna's case, her supposed jealousy and anger were used as proof of madness. Yet her father Ferdinand was ruthless in his political maneuvers, and her son Charles was known for bouts of rage and cold calculation. Neither was labeled insane. The double standard is striking, and it helps explain why the veil of villainy descended upon Joanna so quickly and so completely. Her story is as much about the cultural expectations of women in power as it is about her personal struggles. If we look at the arc of Joanna's life, we see a woman caught in the crossfire of dynastic ambition. She was a daughter, wife, and mother whose role was always defined by the men around her. She was expected to serve as a vessel for alliances, a symbol of continuity, but never truly as an autonomous ruler. When she attempted to assert herself, she was dismissed. When she resisted, she was confined. When she grieved, she was ridiculed. Her so-called madness was, in many respects, a narrative crafted by others to justify their dominance. Whether or not she experienced genuine mental illness at times is a question that cannot be answered with certainty today. What can be said with confidence is that the image of her as a permanently deranged woman is a distortion. The veil of villainy, in her case, was woven by political necessity and cultural prejudice, not by objective truth. This reevaluation does not mean Joanna's life was free of suffering. She endured betrayals by her husband, the loss of children, and the suffocating isolation of confinement that lasted for decades. These experiences would weigh heavily on any human being, and it is entirely possible that they took a toll on her mental health. But to reduce her entire existence to the label of madness is to ignore her strength, her awareness, and the injustice of the way she was treated. To tell her story honestly is not to deny her pain, but to recognize her as more than a caricature. It is to strip away the veil of villainy and see the woman beneath. The example of Joanna of Castile encourages us to look again at others who have been cast as villains or fools by history. How many reputations were shaped by political enemies, by chroniclers with their own agendas, by cultures eager to confirm their biases? How many women in particular were confined to roles of madness, wickedness, or weakness simply because their power was inconvenient? History is not a fixed record, but a story continually rewritten. Each generation has the task of questioning, re-examining, and challenging the labels handed down to them. To accept first impressions uncritically is to risk mistaking propaganda for truth. What Joanna's life reveals is the power of narrative to shape memory for centuries. A queen of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe became, in the popular imagination, nothing more than a tragic madwoman. Yet by looking more closely, by peeling back the layers of distortion, we see something very different. A woman caught in a struggle for sovereignty, betrayed by those closest to her, and remembered not for her rightful authority, but for a story designed to silence her. Her life reminds us that villainy is often in the eye of the storyteller, and that the truth lies hidden behind the veil. By questioning these stories, we do more than recover the dignity of individuals like Joanna. We also remind ourselves to approach the past with humility, aware of how fragile and malleable memory can be. The veil of villainy is not confined to the story of one queen. The same pattern of distortion and reduction appears again and again across history, especially in the lives of women who lived at the heart of political storms. To see how this veil can shift shape but retain its hold, it is worth turning to another figure who has fascinated and divided opinion for centuries: Mary, Queen of Scots. Like Joanna of Castile, Mary became a prisoner of narrative as much as of stone walls. To her supporters, she was a tragic heroine, undone by treachery and betrayal. To her detractors, she was an ambitious schemer, a reckless woman whose choices brought ruin not only upon herself, but upon all who trusted her. Her story has been retold in ballads, plays, novels, and films, often in tones of high drama, always shadowed by controversy. Yet beneath the spectacle lies the same dynamic we saw in Joanna's life: the clash between personal humanity and political necessity, between a woman's right to rule and the structures determined to deny her. Mary was born into extraordinary circumstances. From the moment of her birth in the 16th century, she was Queen of Scotland, the only surviving legitimate child of King James V. Barely more than a week old when her father died, she became a symbol of both hope and vulnerability. As a baby queen, she was powerless, but she was also priceless, a pawn in the great game of European politics. Her marriage was sought after by kings and princes, her person coveted by factions at home and abroad. Like Joanna, her life was never truly her own. From the beginning, she was cast in a role determined by others, and the narrative of her ambition began long before she was old enough to make choices for herself. As a child, she was sent to France, raised in the glittering court of the Valois dynasty. There she was married to the Dauphin Francis, and for a brief time became Queen of France. This union placed her at the heart of one of Europe's most powerful monarchies, and it also sowed the seeds of suspicion that would follow her later. To her Scottish subjects, she became a queen who had spent her formative years abroad, shaped by French customs and Catholic faith, a woman whose identity seemed half foreign. When Francis died young, and Mary returned to Scotland as a widow, she entered a land deeply divided by religious reform and political rivalry. She was a Catholic queen in a kingdom where Protestantism was growing stronger by the year. She was a woman ruling in her own right in a world where female authority was constantly contested. Every choice she made was scrutinized, every misstep magnified, every gesture interpreted through the lens of suspicion. The most infamous chapter of Mary's story, the one that sealed her reputation as reckless and ambitious, was the scandal surrounding the murder of her second husband, Henry Lord Darnley. Their marriage had already been fraught, marked by jealousy, resentment, and public quarrels. When Darnley was killed in an explosion at Kirk Field, suspicion immediately fell on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, with whom Mary was rumored to have been romantically involved. When she married Bothwell not long after, the whispers of complicity became a roar. To her enemies, this was proof of her ambition and corruption. She was painted as a woman who conspired in her husband's murder in order to grasp power with a new partner at her side. The image of Mary as femme fatale, as a dangerous queen whose passions outweighed her duty, was fixed in the minds of many. It gave her enemies in Scotland the justification they needed to rebel, to force her abdication in favor of her infant son James, and to drive her into the long years of captivity in England under her cousin Elizabeth. This version of events has been repeated for centuries, yet like the coffin tale of Joanna of Castile, it deserves closer examination. The sources that shaped this narrative were far from impartial. Much of the case against Mary relied on the so-called casket letters, documents allegedly written by her to Bothwell that implicated her in Darnley's death. These letters were presented by her enemies in Scotland as evidence of her guilt, but their authenticity has been debated ever since. Many scholars argue they were forged or at least tampered with, produced at a moment when her deposition was politically convenient. For Elizabeth of England, who held Mary captive, the circulation of these documents was also useful. Elizabeth could justify keeping her cousin under watch, avoiding both the scandal of executing a fellow sovereign and the danger of allowing her to rule freely. The narrative of Mary as guilty, reckless, and ambitious served too many interests to be dismissed. In recent decades, historians have sought to re-examine the evidence with greater care. Some argue that Mary was not the mastermind of Darnley's death, but its victim, caught in a web of conspiracies woven by powerful men who saw her authority as a threat. Darnley himself had made enemies among the Scottish nobility, and his murder may have been less the result of Mary's passion than of broader political calculations. Her marriage to Bothwell, often seen as proof of complicity, can also be read in a different light. Contemporary accounts suggest she may have been coerced into the union, perhaps even abducted by Bothwell. If this interpretation is true, then what has long been read as reckless ambition might in fact have been another instance of a queen maneuvered and constrained by the ambitions of others. Like Joanna before her, Mary was vulnerable to the way stories could be framed, and once framed, those stories became nearly impossible to challenge. The role of gender in shaping Mary's reputation is impossible to ignore. Elizabeth of England, her cousin and rival, managed to rule with authority by carefully crafting an image of herself as a virgin queen, married to her kingdom and free from personal entanglements. She turned her singleness into a weapon, a symbol of self-sacrifice for the sake of her subjects. Mary, by contrast, was condemned for her marriages, for her sexuality, for her apparent inability to separate personal feeling from public duty. When Elizabeth displayed caution and calculation, she was praised as wise. When Mary displayed emotion or passion, she was branded unstable and dangerous. The double standard is clear. Both women lived under the same pressure of ruling in a man's world, but Elizabeth found a way to shape the narrative to her advantage, while Mary became trapped in one she could not control. The cultural afterlife of Mary's story reveals how enduring these narratives can be. In plays, operas, and films, she is often portrayed as a doomed romantic, a woman undone by her heart. This sympathetic image softens the older portrayal of her as a villain, but it still reduces her to stereotype. She is either the reckless schemer or the tragic victim, rarely the thoughtful ruler navigating impossible choices. The complexity of her political situation, the reality of her limited options, and the calculated maneuvers of those around her are often lost in the telling. The veil of villainy here does not always take the form of outright condemnation. Sometimes it is the softer veil of sentimentality, which is no less distorting. Either way, the true woman, with all her strengths and weaknesses, remains obscured. To uncover the deeper truth of Mary's life is to recognize the pressures she faced that went beyond personal choices. She was queen in a land riven by religious conflict, expected to reconcile factions that distrusted her faith. She was queen in a patriarchal society that questioned whether a woman could rule at all. She was cousin to Elizabeth, a Protestant queen in England, and by blood the next heir to that throne. Her very existence was a threat to Elizabeth's stability, as Catholic subjects and foreign powers alike saw her as a rallying point. Against this backdrop, every misstep was magnified, every rumor weaponized, every action interpreted in the darkest possible way. To be ambitious was to be condemned. To be cautious was to be weak. To be passionate was to be dangerous. It was a no-win situation, and it is no wonder that history has struggled to do her justice. When viewed alongside Joanna of Castile, Mary's story underscores a larger truth about the writing of history. The lives of queens are often remembered less for their policies or decisions than for their relationships, their emotions, and the narratives others constructed around them. Men in power could be ruthless, ambitious, and even murderous, yet still be remembered as strong or effective rulers. Women who displayed the same traits were vilified, pathologized, or sentimentalized. The veil of villainy is not just a trick of memory. It is a reflection of deep-seated assumptions about gender and power that shaped the way stories were told and retold. By examining the sources critically, by questioning whose interests they served, we begin to see how much of what we take for granted is less history than propaganda. This recognition is not about turning Mary into a saint or denying the mistakes she made. She was human, and like any human being, she made choices that were sometimes unwise, sometimes self-defeating. But to see her only through the lens of ambition and folly is to do her a disservice. It is to forget the immense pressures under which she lived, the narrow paths available to her, the ways her enemies shaped the story to their advantage. Like Joanna, she deserves to be remembered not as a caricature, but as a complex figure caught in the currents of her time. Her life was not simply the tale of a villain or a victim, but of a queen who struggled, endured, and left behind a legacy that still demands to be understood in its fullness. By looking at these two queens side by side, we gain more than just a clearer picture of their individual lives. We begin to see the patterns that link them, the recurring ways in which women in power have been reduced, distorted, or condemned. Their stories remind us that history is not neutral, that the past we inherit is shaped by the voices that wrote it and the interests those voices served. To challenge the veil of villainy is to acknowledge the complexity of human lives, to resist the urge to simplify, to allow space for nuance and contradiction. Only then can we begin to honor the truth of those who came before us, and only then can we learn the lessons their lives still have to teach. The veil of villainy does not dissolve easily, and the case of Mary, Queen of Scots, makes this point with piercing clarity. Yet she was far from alone in being trapped within a narrative that exaggerated her flaws while muting her strengths. The same patterns can be seen in the life of another queen whose name has long been wrapped in suspicion and hostility, Catherine de' Medici. If Mary is remembered as the reckless romantic and Joanna of Castile as the mad recluse, Catherine has been cast as the cold manipulator, the dark presence at the French court who, so the stories go, schemed endlessly and unleashed rivers of blood in her pursuit of power. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre has been laid at her feet for centuries, used as proof of her cruelty, her fanaticism, and her supposed delight in destruction. Yet when we look past the convenient labels and consider the realities of her position, we begin to see a more complicated figure emerge. Catherine's life was defined by survival and strategy. The decisions she made, while often harsh and controversial, were rooted not in mindless malice, but in the desperate need to hold together a fractured kingdom and to preserve the dynasty her marriage had joined her to. Catherine was born into the powerful but precarious Medici family of Florence. Orphaned early, she spent much of her childhood as a pawn in the shifting struggles of Italian politics. When she was married to Henry, the second son of King Francis of France, her future seemed uncertain. She was not of royal blood, and many in the French court looked down on her as an outsider. For years her position remained fragile, especially as Henry was openly devoted to his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. But when her husband unexpectedly inherited the throne as King Henry II, Catherine's place at court shifted dramatically. By the time Henry died and left her the mother of young kings, her role transformed once again. She became the queen mother, regent, and guardian of a dynasty at risk. France was torn by religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, its nobility fractured into warring factions, its crown vulnerable to being seized or diminished. In this cauldron, Catherine learned to survive by balancing, negotiating, and manipulating. Her strategies were not those of a saint, but neither were they those of a mindless villain. They were the strategies of someone who understood that survival required constant adjustment and ruthless pragmatism. The defining event of her reputation, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, has long been told in stark terms. In this account, Catherine engineered the slaughter of thousands of Protestants gathered in Paris for the wedding of her daughter Marguerite to Henry of Navarre. Supposedly, she lured Protestant leaders into a false sense of security, only to order their destruction in one night of bloodshed that spread throughout France. For generations, this story cemented her as a symbol of cruelty and deception, a queen mother drenched in the blood of her people. Yet, as with Joanna and Mary, we must ask, whose story was this, and to what end was it told? When we examine the evidence more closely, we find that Catherine's role, while significant, may not align with the caricature. In the years leading up to the massacre, France had been convulsed by repeated civil wars between Catholics and Protestants. The marriage of her daughter to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant, was intended as a gesture of reconciliation, a chance to bring peace through dynastic alliance. Yet the tensions were far from resolved. The presence of Admiral Coligny, a leading Protestant figure, at court made matters worse, as he was gaining influence over King Charles IX. To Catholic hardliners, this was intolerable. The attempted assassination of Coligny in the days before the massacre ignited fears on all sides. Catherine, facing the very real possibility that her young son would be swept into the orbit of Coligny and dragged into a dangerous foreign war against Spain, may have acted out of desperation. The violence that followed was not necessarily the product of her design, but the eruption of long-simmering hatreds, fueled by factions eager to seize the moment. Even if we accept that Catherine approved targeted killings of Protestant leaders to protect the monarchy, the scale of the massacre was far beyond what she could have intended or controlled. Contemporary accounts suggest that once the violence began in Paris, it spread rapidly, carried by rumor and by the deep resentments within local communities. To lay the entire event at Catherine's feet is to simplify a complex and chaotic moment into a single villainous act. It also ignores the broader reality. She was a regent trying to keep her dynasty afloat in a kingdom that seemed poised to tear itself apart. Her choice may have been brutal, but it was not simply the product of malice. It was shaped by the impossible pressures of her position. Catherine's strategic brilliance extended beyond that one infamous episode. For decades she maneuvered between factions, arranging marriages, brokering truces, and using her children as political tools in an effort to preserve the crown. She was not a ruler free to act as she pleased, but a woman bound by the limitations of her role as mother and regent, surrounded by ambitious nobles who would seize power if she faltered. Her reliance on compromise and shifting alliances was often interpreted as deceitful or opportunistic, yet it reflected the reality of governing a divided realm. She employed pageantry, spectacle, and careful symbolism to project authority, staging elaborate court festivities that both displayed royal power and masked the fragility of the monarchy. These were not the empty games of a vain queen, but deliberate efforts to stabilize a volatile political landscape. The darker images of Catherine, the poisoner, the witch, the ruthless Italian, were shaped as much by prejudice as by fact. As a Medici, she was linked in the minds of many French subjects with Italian cunning and corruption. The mythology of her dabbling in astrology or dark arts grew in the telling, cementing her as an almost mythical villainess. Yet when we sift through the evidence, we find not spells and potions, but calculations and negotiations. She read the currents of power and acted to prevent her family from being swept away. The vilification of Catherine was not only a judgment on her choices, but also a reflection of xenophobia and misogyny. As an Italian woman ruling in France, her every move was suspect, her every decision subject to malicious reinterpretation. Recent historians have emphasized this need for reevaluation. Far from being a destroyer of France, Catherine may be better understood as one of the few figures who prevented its complete collapse. She guided her sons during some of the most turbulent decades of French history, managing to keep the monarchy intact when civil war could easily have swept it away entirely. Her policies of limited toleration, though inconsistent, reflected a genuine attempt to balance irreconcilable factions. Her use of dynastic marriages sought to weave France into the broader fabric of European alliances, offering her kingdom protection and her family security. Even the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, while a tragedy, cannot erase the decades she spent navigating crises that might have destroyed less capable rulers. When we reconsider Catherine through this lens, we begin to see how the veil of villainy has once again obscured a more nuanced truth. Her legacy, like those of Joanna and Mary, was shaped by stories told by enemies, by the biases of chroniclers, and by the expectations placed on women in power. To call her ruthless is not inaccurate, but to stop there is to miss the context in which that ruthlessness operated. Male rulers who employed similar strategies are remembered as shrewd or pragmatic. Catherine was called monstrous. The difference lies not in the actions themselves, but in the way they were framed. The stories of these queens, taken together, form a pattern that cannot be ignored. Each was cast into roles that simplified and distorted their lives. Joanna as the madwoman, Mary as the reckless schemer, Catherine as the bloodthirsty manipulator. Yet beneath these labels we find women navigating worlds that were hostile to their authority, where every decision was fraught, where their survival depended on balancing forces that threatened to overwhelm them. They were not saints, but neither were they the villains of legend. They were rulers, mothers, and survivors whose legacies deserve to be read with care, with attention to context, and with recognition of the ways in which gender and power shape memory. To strip away the veil of villainy from Catherine is not to excuse every decision she made. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre remains a dark stain on her regency, a moment of horror that cannot be softened by context alone. Yet even here, understanding the pressures she faced allows us to see her as more than a caricature. She was a queen mother who inherited a kingdom in turmoil, who used the tools available to her, negotiation, spectacle, marriage, and when necessary, force, to preserve her dynasty. That she has been remembered primarily as a monster says less about her than about the way history punishes women who exercise power in ways that make men uncomfortable. Her brilliance, her resilience, and her capacity for strategy deserve recognition alongside the darker chapters. In revisiting these stories, we are reminded of the power of narrative to shape memory. What endures is often not the full truth, but the version that served the strongest voices of the time. For Joanna, that meant a story of madness that justified her confinement. For Mary, it meant a tale of reckless ambition that justified her deposition and captivity. For Catherine, it meant a legend of cruelty that justified the dismissal of her statesmanship. By questioning these stories, by unpacking the complexities hidden beneath the labels, we do not erase their flaws or tragedies. We restore their humanity, and in doing so, we gain a clearer sense of how history is written and how it can be rewritten. The lives of queens who bore the weight of power in fractured, suspicious courts remind us again and again that their stories are not as straightforward as the myths passed down to us. Catherine de' Medici has long been remembered as a schemer whose very name is tied to bloodshed. Yet a closer look reveals a mother and regent fighting to preserve her dynasty in a kingdom on the brink of collapse. If her resilience and statecraft were cloaked beneath accusations of cruelty, the same can be said of another queen who lived more than 2 centuries later, though in a very different world. Marie Antoinette of France, the last queen before the Revolution, has perhaps one of the most infamous reputations in all of European history. Her name has become synonymous with frivolity, excess, and detachment from the plight of her people. The phrase, "let them eat cake," still clings to her memory, even though there is no evidence she ever uttered it. She has been portrayed as a symbol of extravagance, a woman whose callousness and indulgence embodied the decay of the old order. Yet just as the coffin of Joanna of Castile, the letters of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the massacre tied to Catherine de' Medici became stories too convenient to question, the caricature of Marie Antoinette as a shallow and selfish queen tells only part of the tale. When we look beyond the myths, we find a woman of surprising resilience, one whose personal strength was overshadowed by the condemnation that her world heaped upon her. Marie Antoinette was born in Vienna in the mid-18th century as the 15th child of Maria Theresa, the formidable Habsburg empress who ruled one of Europe's great powers. From the beginning, her life was marked by dynastic calculation rather than personal choice. As part of a strategy to secure peace between Austria and France, she was married at just 14 to the French Dauphin, the future Louis XVI. For a teenage girl raised in the comparatively warm and tightly knit court of Vienna, the move to Versailles was not just a change of scenery, but a plunge into a different universe. The court of Versailles was rigid, formal, and unforgiving, a world where every gesture, every look, and every word was subject to scrutiny. Marie Antoinette was expected to adapt instantly to this environment, to bear children who would secure the Bourbon line, and to embody the grace and dignity of a French queen. Yet she arrived ill-prepared, her education incomplete, her personality unsuited to the suffocating rituals of a court that delighted in gossip and intrigue. It was in this setting that the myth of her frivolity and detachment began to grow. Her early years at Versailles were marked by ridicule and criticism. The marriage between Marie Antoinette and Louis was not consummated for 7 years, a fact that became the subject of endless rumor and mockery. She was blamed for the delay, accused of coldness or failure, even though the problem largely lay with her husband's physical difficulties and his own hesitation. This failure to produce an heir left her vulnerable, her legitimacy questioned, her very purpose doubted. To cope with the pressures and humiliations, she sought refuge in a circle of friends, theater, music, and fashion. She spent freely on clothes and jewels, though in truth her spending was not extraordinary by royal standards of the time. Yet the perception of wastefulness began to attach itself to her name, amplified by pamphlets and gossip. The Queen's image as a frivolous foreigner took root, and in the years that followed, it hardened into the lasting caricature that would survive long after her death. The most enduring myth, of course, is the phrase, "let them eat cake." First attributed to her decades after she supposedly said it, the line actually appeared in earlier writings by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where it was not linked to her at all. There is no credible evidence that Marie Antoinette ever uttered those words, and yet they became the symbol of her supposed callousness toward the suffering of the poor. The truth is that she was not ignorant of hardship, nor was she indifferent. Records show that she often engaged in acts of charity, donating to hospitals, orphanages, and victims of disaster. She sponsored the work of artists and musicians, and in private correspondence, she expressed concern for the struggles of her people. But in a climate of resentment toward the monarchy, no act of kindness could outweigh the force of a convenient slander. To say that the Queen had mocked starving peasants by suggesting cake was to create a story that perfectly encapsulated the anger of the moment. Once spoken, it was too powerful to be unmade. Yet what stands out when we examine her personal letters and accounts from those close to her is not a woman lost in excess, but one struggling to maintain dignity and resilience in the face of relentless hostility. Marie Antoinette adored her children and devoted herself to them with a tenderness that was noted by observers. In a world where royal children were often raised by attendants at a distance, she insisted on being involved in their lives. She worried constantly about their health, wrote affectionate notes, and sought to shield them from the storms of politics. Even in the chaos of the revolution, when her own life was in danger, she remained focused on their well-being, clinging to her role as a mother as the last anchor of stability in a collapsing world. Her resilience can be seen in the way she endured isolation, slander, and the crumbling of everything around her, yet refused to abandon her sense of self or her responsibilities. Daily life at Versailles also reveals the ways she tried to carve out spaces of authenticity in an artificial court. Her retreat to the Petit Trianon, a small estate on the grounds of Versailles, has often been mocked as escapism, a queen playing at being a shepherdess while her people suffered. But this interpretation ignores what the space meant to her. At the Petit Trianon, she could escape the rigid ceremonies of court life and experience moments of privacy, friendship, and freedom. It was not about indifference to her people's suffering, but about reclaiming some semblance of personal life in a system that allowed her almost none. That this desire for respite was later twisted into evidence of selfishness reveals more about the hunger for scandal than about her true character. The revolution brought her resilience into even sharper relief. As the monarchy crumbled, she was vilified in increasingly obscene pamphlets that accused her of every vice imaginable, from sexual deviance to treason. The infamous Austrian woman was accused of conspiring with her homeland against France, of manipulating her husband, of corrupting the court. The vitriol was relentless, and yet she continued to write letters that showed not hysteria but composure. When she and her family attempted to escape Paris in the flight to Varennes and were captured, it sealed their fate. But even then, her letters reveal a woman more focused on protecting her children and supporting her husband than on her own fears. In her final months, imprisoned and awaiting trial, her resilience became even more striking. She endured the separation from her children, the humiliation of public hatred, and the certainty of her approaching death with a courage that moved even some of her enemies. Her last letter, written to her sister-in-law Elizabeth, is one of profound dignity and faith, filled with concern for her children and gratitude for the loyalty of those who had stood by her. It shows a woman who, in the face of ruin, clung not to bitterness but to love and principle. This is not the image of a frivolous queen, but of a human being who bore extraordinary suffering with strength. When we place Marie Antoinette alongside Joanna of Castile, Mary, Queen of Scots, and Catherine de Medici, a shared thread becomes visible. Each woman was trapped in narratives that exaggerated their flaws and denied their complexity. Joanna was remembered as mad, Mary as reckless, Catherine as cruel, and Marie Antoinette as frivolous. In each case, the truth was far more complex. Each faced impossible pressures, each acted in ways shaped by survival, and each displayed resilience that was overshadowed by condemnation. The myths that grew around them were not random, but were crafted by political needs, cultural prejudices, and the desires of those who benefited from their downfall. The resilience of Marie Antoinette, in particular, forces us to reconsider how we define strength in the context of queenship. Strength is often equated with triumph, conquest, or domination, qualities celebrated in male rulers. But in the lives of these women, strength often took the form of endurance, of bearing humiliation and confinement without losing selfhood, of facing ruin with composure, of continuing to act with care for children and loyalty to principles even when the world condemned them. Their resilience was quiet, often invisible beneath the louder accusations of madness, ambition, cruelty, or frivolity. Yet it was no less real, and in some ways it was more profound, for it was strength exercised without the power to control the narratives that consumed them. Marie Antoinette's life, reimagined beyond the caricature, becomes a study in adaptation and survival within one of the most oppressive royal courts of Europe. She learned to navigate the labyrinth of Versailles, endured years of personal humiliation, sought moments of authenticity in the midst of ritual and performance, and finally met her death with courage. To reduce her to a shallow phrase she never uttered is to erase the depth of her humanity. To recover her resilience is to see her not as a villain or a symbol, but as a woman whose life speaks to the broader theme that runs through the stories of queens across centuries. That power, when held by women, was always precarious, always contested, and always subject to distortion. In the end, the personal journeys of queens like Marie Antoinette remind us that resilience is not always about victory. Sometimes it is about endurance in the face of ruin, about holding fast to dignity when stripped of power, about maintaining humanity when condemned by history. Their stories challenge us to look beyond the labels and the myths, to see the complexity of human lives shaped by forces beyond their control. And in doing so, they remind us that the veil of villainy, though powerful, is never the whole truth. The stories of queens such as Joanna of Castile, Mary, Queen of Scots, Catherine de' Medici, and Marie Antoinette offer more than isolated lessons about the distortions of their particular lives. They echo across time, reminding us that history itself is not a fixed ledger of events, but a living fabric stitched together by voices, biases, omissions, and deliberate manipulations. The thread that binds these women is not simply their royalty, but the way in which their reputations were shaped, sometimes centuries after their deaths, into neat caricatures that could be easily understood, easily condemned, and easily repeated. Madness, ambition, cruelty, and frivolity became shorthand explanations, reducing them to one-dimensional figures in stories designed to serve the needs of their contemporaries or later generations. Yet when we peel back these layers of myth, what we discover is not just the humanity of individuals long gone, but also a warning about the way narratives function in every age, including our own. In looking at Joanna, we saw how political necessity required her father and later her son to erase her authority by painting her as unfit, a woman incapable of reason. The label of madness, once applied, absolved them of guilt in stripping her sovereignty, while ensuring that posterity remembered her not as a rightful queen, but as a tragic madwoman. In Mary, we encountered the double bind of a queen caught between religious divisions and political rivalries, whose marriages and missteps were recast into evidence of dangerous ambition. The contested casket letters and the endless retelling of her husband's murder reveal how fragile truth becomes when propaganda finds fertile ground. Catherine, perhaps the most maligned of the group, showed us how strategic acumen could be reframed as villainy, how an Italian outsider who kept a kingdom from collapse was turned into a monster associated with blood and poison. And in Marie Antoinette, we saw how slander in pamphlets and the relentless hunger for scapegoats transformed a woman of resilience and private tenderness into the embodiment of aristocratic cruelty, immortalized by a phrase she never spoke. What unites all these queens is not that they were flawless. Each made choices that can and should be scrutinized, but that their flaws were inflated while their strengths were ignored. Their reputations served the political, cultural, and social needs of those who shaped the stories. Madness justified confinement. Recklessness justified deposition. Cruelty justified suspicion. Frivolity justified revolution. The simplifications were useful, and in their usefulness they endured. But usefulness is not the same as truth. and to confuse the two is to allow the voices of the past to dictate the boundaries of memory without question. This matters because history is never only about the past. The way we tell these stories reflects the values, anxieties, and prejudices of the present. When we accept easy labels without question, we risk repeating the same patterns in our own time. Just as Joanna's anger was called madness while her husband's betrayal was excused, or Mary's passion was framed as recklessness while Elizabeth's calculation was framed as wisdom, we too must ask how gender, power, and social bias continue to shape the reputations of those in positions of authority today. How many contemporary figures, particularly women or outsiders, are still defined by caricatures created by their opponents, repeated uncritically until they harden into common knowledge. The echo of these queens reminds us to be wary, to pause before accepting the first story we are told, and to ask whose interests that story serves. Critical thinking, then, is not an abstract skill, but a necessary tool for navigating both history and the present. To look again at the past is to practice the discipline of questioning, of refusing to settle for the first impression, of being alert to distortion. It teaches us that voices are silenced not only by censorship, but by misrepresentation, that reputations can be destroyed not only by failure, but by narrative. By challenging the myths around figures like Marie Antoinette or Catherine de Medici, we learn to question the myths around those who shape our world today. By understanding how propaganda worked in the 16th or 18th century, we better understand how it works in the 21st. These stories still matter because they remind us that truth requires effort, skepticism, and a willingness to see complexity where simplicity is easier. The relevance also lies in the humanity of these women, which emerges so clearly once the myths are stripped away. Joanna was not simply mad, but a daughter, wife, and mother whose grief and resistance were understandable. Mary was not simply reckless, but a ruler navigating impossible divides, a cousin under constant threat, a mother separated from her son. Catherine was not simply cruel, but a regent who endured prejudice and fought with all the tools available to her to hold a fractured kingdom together. Marie Antoinette was not simply frivolous, but a woman who faced humiliation, vilification, and death with composure, who found joy in her children and courage in her last days. To recover these dimensions is to honor the dignity of lives that were flattened into symbols, to restore to them the complexity denied them by centuries of slander. And in doing so, we also affirm our own responsibility to resist flattening those around us today into convenient labels. The echo of their stories is also a reminder of resilience. Though each of these queens suffered condemnation, confinement, or death, their ability to endure, to adapt, or to face ruin with courage speaks to a strength that transcends the narratives written against them. Strength in history is often celebrated as conquest or domination, but here we see another kind of strength: survival in hostile environments, resilience in the face of ruin, and the ability to maintain dignity when stripped of power. That lesson is timeless. In a world where misrepresentation and caricature still thrive, their resilience becomes an example of how humanity can persist even when the world condemns. Bringing their stories together also challenges us to broaden the way we think about history itself. Too often, history is consumed as entertainment, simplified into heroes and villains, saints and monsters. But the past was never that neat, and neither is the present. By embracing the complexity, by refusing to accept myths without question, we gain not only a clearer view of what came before, but also a more honest perspective on ourselves. The echoes of these queens remind us that history is not a morality play to be consumed passively, but a dialogue to be engaged with critically. Every story we inherit demands to be questioned, contextualized, and reimagined, not for the sake of tearing it down, but for the sake of uncovering the truth that lies hidden beneath the myths. For those who listen to these echoes, there is also an invitation. Think of the historical figures you know, the ones dismissed with a single label: mad, wicked, ambitious, frivolous, and ask whether the truth might be more complicated. Think of the stories you were taught and consider whose voices were left out, whose reputations were shaped by enemies, whose humanity was buried beneath propaganda. History is not something given to us complete. It is something we participate in by questioning, challenging, and seeking to understand. Just as we can re-examine the lives of Joanna, Mary, Catherine, and Marie Antoinette, we can re-examine countless others. In doing so, we honor not only the individuals themselves, but also the principle that truth is worth pursuing, even when it is inconvenient, even when it resists simplicity. These stories matter because they are not only about queens in palaces centuries ago, but about the universal human struggle to be seen and remembered honestly. They matter because they reveal how power distorts perception, how gender shapes memory, and how resilience can persist beneath condemnation. And they matter because they call on us to resist the easy stories and embrace the hard work of critical thought. If we accept caricatures in the past, we are more likely to accept them in the present. If we challenge them in the past, we prepare ourselves to challenge them now. Ask yourself whether their stories might hold more than the labels suggest. Share those names, bring them forward, and together we can uncover the truths that lie beneath the myths. The work of deconstruction does not belong to the past alone. It belongs to us all, here and now, as we listen to the echoes of history and decide how they will shape the